Jonathan Taylor is our keynote speaker, and he's a former instructor for Texas A&M, and he has developed a Voice for Male Students, an absolutely outstanding resource that you can use to look for all sorts of information about educational attainment, scholarships for men, and anything that you could find regarding the cultural climate for educational issues. And what makes a Voice for Male Students so outstanding is that it really is very hard data, stuff that you can verify for yourself. It's basically a reference site as well as an excellent place by which you can evaluate all of the, just pretty much everything that's happening to boys today in education. He is a former instructor in English, and what makes it so outstanding is his experience really shows. And his ability to articulate the issues is something that really, I don't know if I can actually articulate his skill myself. And I want you all to help me welcome him today, because he is going to show us an overview of everything, as much as he can anyway, within the 50 minutes allotted, of what's been happening today for men and boys around the world in education. Please welcome Jonathan Taylor. You're gonna kind of be away from it, but you're gonna hold this mic up too. 2 audio feeds.
Okay. Can you guys hear me okay? Yep. First, whoa. Need to hold this really close to my face. All right. Make sure and yell at me if this starts drifting away from my face. I kind of get caught up in a whole bunch of stuff, so do let me know. Just give me 1 second here. All right, great. All right, thank you guys. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to KSU for hosting this conference. Thank you especially to Sage Gerard and to KSU Men. What I really hope to do during this presentation is to just go over a lot of the basics of the issues and point to a few solutions. As a disclaimer, an entire course could easily be taught on this topic, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to limit myself to hitting a lot of the high notes. By the time we're done, though, I promise you that you will know more about men's and boys' education issues than the vast majority of teachers entering into the workforce today. And also, if you would like to verify any of the sources, any of the information that I present in this conference, I'm going to be posting online all of the sources and this full PowerPoint presentation at voiceformalestudents.com. So feel free to avail yourself of that resource if you'd like to look into these issues further. My dream as an undergrad was to become a professor of English. When I got on the other side of the teacher's desk, however, I quickly discovered, as many teachers do, that there was a lot more to being a teacher than actual teaching. But in this case, I'm not referring to the usual things, like when a student comes into your office and says, hey, family member got in a car wreck, so I wasn't able to do my homework, can I get an extension, that kind of thing. I still had that. But here I'm talking about the politics of academia. I realized very early in my teaching career that there was a problem with how gender equity in education was framed. I realized that there were a lot of problems that were affecting men and boys that were, number one, ignored by people who could have and should have known better. Number two, a lot of these problems were being made worse by some of these people. And number three, that people who tried to raise awareness of these issues, people who tried to make a change, often had the tendency to be ignored, to be marginalized, or in some cases harassed. For those reasons, among others, I opted for a different career path. But I never gave up my interest in the teaching profession. I also didn't want to just run away from the problem, so I went on to create voiceformalestudents.com. The motto of my website, which is also the topic, more or less, of this conference, is educational equity for men and boys. It's an interesting phrase in that despite its incredible relevance to academia today, it's not a phrase that's on the lips of many academics. First, I just want to go over going over the basics. Let's just go ahead and define what educational equity is, and starting off by asking what is equity. I would advise you, as someone who majored in language arts, that the dictionary is not always the final arbiter of meaning, but here I think the dictionary definition is apt. Equity, according to Merriam-Webster, is quite simply fairness or justice in the way that people are treated. If you notice, there are competing models of equality. When some people talk about equality, they simply talk about living a life free of discrimination. When other people talk about equality, they talk about the notion of equal representation, such as having 50% men, 50% women as outcomes in each given area of life. I think it reasonable to say that we cannot always guarantee that both sexes will have absolute equal outcomes. But what we can do is look at the process of what goes on in academia and make sure that it's fair. You should know that the law which governs gender equity in education is a federal law called Title IX, the text of which simply states no person in the United States shall on the basis of sex be excluded from participation in, denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Lastly, to round out the definition of educational equity, what is a good education? And it's a more contentious and problematic question than you might at first think. For example, if by the time a young man graduates from college, he can write computer code proficiently, but can't get a passing grade on an essay or a written report without a teacher throwing him a curve, would you say that that is a good education? If he masters a skill that makes him valuable in the job market, but doesn't have the interpersonal and verbal skills to market himself effectively or to navigate workplace relationships, would you say that he is well educated? If huge numbers of boys demonstrate incredible aptitude for learning new things outside the classroom and very limited aptitude inside the classroom, would you say that's a problem with the boys or a problem with our education system? And would you consider those boys well educated? These are all important questions when it comes to defining a good education. But at the very least, I think we should all agree, I hope, that a good education is one in which students obtain good reasoning and critical thinking skills, a well-rounded basic threshold of knowledge, as well as a desire and aptitude to be, and here's an education buzzword for you, lifelong learners. So we know what educational equity is generally. Why should we care? There's a lot of reasons. Number one, it improves the economy. Well-educated people tend to be much more economically mobile because they have a broader skill set. Number two, it increases intellectual diversity. Men and women do not always behave the same way. They don't always have the same backgrounds, and it's to our collective benefit that we understand and explore this. Number three, believe it or not, most women and men don't like to attend schools where there's all women or all dudes. They like a balance. And last but not least, and this is my favorite, I'll admit my bias is, because men and boys are human. And as such, whenever they fall behind, whenever they suffer, they are intrinsically deserving of our compassion and our support. Now you may say, thank you. And that should be a good enough reason in and of itself. Now you may say, some people may say, oh, well, yeah, duh, of course. They're human. That's obvious to everyone, isn't it? Well, as we will see, there are some, and unfortunately some within our education system, who could use a gentle reminder. I like to divide men's and boys' education issues into three main areas. The first is educational attainment and well-being. The second is rights and protections. And the third is institutional and cultural bias. Those are just kind of handy-dandy categories. You'll see why I divide those into that in a minute. I'm just going to go ahead and jump into the first section, which is educational attainment and well-being. This is a set of graphs. I want you all to pay good attention to this. This is a set of graphs on what percentage of degrees are conferred to men and what percentage conferred to women in the last 40 years in the United States. Associates, bachelor's, master's, doctorates. The line at the top in all those cases at the end is women. The bottom line is men. You will notice that there is a staggering decline in the academic achievement among male college students with no end in sight. What you'll also notice is that men became the minority of graduates as far back as 1978. So this isn't a new thing. The only thing that is new is the willingness of a principled few to even talk about these things at all. You would be amazed, out of all the teachers, out of all the administrators that I've talked to, how many of them, and that is to say most of them, when I presented this data, will just come back and say, I've never seen that data before. And there's a certain element, a certain part of me that says, you know, isn't it kind of your job to know? I mean, you're the one who gets paid to do this. And it's not like this is some kind of arcane knowledge that is hidden away and only represents, 0.1% of the student population. Graduation rates are a very basic type of educational data with very broad implications. This data comes to us straight from the National Center of Education Statistics, which is part of the Department of Education. You can find that on a quick Google search. Here's also something to keep in mind. Whether in tuition to our local universities, whether in taxes to the Department of Education, you, me, all of us, we all pay inordinate sums of money to people who make rather decent salaries, who are charged with the task of monitoring the gaps between various demographics, and when those gaps become problematic, creating a public dialogue about what needs to change. But when it comes to men's issues, there really hasn't been a broad public discussion. And that's one of the reasons why there is such incredible pushback to discussing men's and boys' education issues, because the more the public is educated on what's on the reality that male students face in terms of education outcomes, the more people are going to be asked, who are going to ask the people who are running our education system, what have you been doing all of this time with all of this money, all of this status, all of this power that we have given you? What have you been doing? And the answer is 9 times out of 10, an answer that they're not prepared to a question they're not prepared to answer, because the answer is nothing. Excuse me. But graduation rates really are just the beginning. Men and boys are also 28% more likely to drop out of high school, again from the National Center for Education Statistics. The Educational Testing Service, which is the institution which administers like the GRE and a whole bunch of gateway-type exams, they have measured that the gap favoring girls in writing concepts is 6 times the gap favoring boys in math concepts. Boys are also 75% of students diagnosed with learning disabilities. They're also diagnosed twice as often as girls with ADHD, 9 times as likely to be referred by a teacher for diagnosis, and medicated 2.8 times as often for ADHD. That's just again, there's more. They're diagnosed 5 times as often with autism. They're 4 times as likely to commit suicide overall, and they are 6 times as likely in the late high school year and early college years, between the ages of 15 to 24, to kill themselves. They're twice as likely to be suspended in lower ed overall, although in preschool that rate spikes up to 4.5%, and they're also 3 times as likely to be expelled. They're also much less likely to participate in extracurricular activities, student organizations, student clubs, music, performing arts, you name it. They're very isolated on campus today, and they just don't have a lot of outreach coming their way. Excuse me, I'm going to backtrack real quick. So that's the bad news. There's a lot of ways in which academia, as well as our general culture, could improve the situation. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this section is just go over a few that I recommend, starting with what I think are the most important. Number 1, we need more positive male role models for our boys, which come in many forms. Many boys today are growing up without dads in the home. They get into elementary school and the teachers are all women. For many boys, the same is true whenever they get into middle school, and they won't have a good relationship with a positive male role model until they enter high school, and that's far too late. Because by the time they reach middle school, a lot of their peers, a lot of their friends start replacing parents and teachers as role models for behavior, or what some people would call socializing agents. In other words, what this translates to in practice is that a lot of the time, boys are effectively raising themselves. One of the things that they drill into your head in teacher training, which I've been through quite a few rounds of teacher training, is that you always have to set high expectations for your students. Generally, students will only shoot as high as you set the bar, so that's why you have to have high expectations. Translate that phenomenon to what happens in the family. Parents who want their kids to turn out well should also have high expectations of their students. And also, here's something that a lot of people don't consider. Parents tend to have higher expectations of kids of the same sex. So mothers tend to have higher expectations of daughters, and fathers tend to have higher expectations of sons. So what happens is that when there's a lot of fathers that are removed from the family, we're removing a lot of fathers who are going to set those high expectations for our boys. Not only will fathers have higher expectations, and they'll also tend to have different parenting styles as well. Fathers also tend to get down on the carpet and engage with kids in a kind of rowdy kind of play. This not only allows boys a medium to express the physical side of their nature, but it also teaches them the proper boundaries of physical play. So what happens is many of these kids who don't have that experience, who have not experienced setting their boundaries in this area, they're going into early childhood education, and they don't know what the proper boundaries are because no one has taught them. So they get engaged in horseplay with other kids, and that is one of the reasons why they get expelled so often. Again, the rates or suspended so often. Again, the rates of suspension go up to 4.5 times the rate of girls in preschool. Now, I want to be careful in talking about the family, about the role of parents, about the responsibilities of parents, because I guarantee you that as soon as someone says that there's something that needs to change about our families, someone in education, some teacher, some administrator is going to seize on that, and they're going to say, see, we don't need to change anything on our end. It's all the fault of the parents, and vice versa. Some parents do that as well. They'll seize upon one little thing that happens with our education system. There's a lot to be improved about the education system, but don't fall into the trap of thinking that we don't need to change anything on the home front or in our education system, because this is a very multifaceted issue, and there's a lot of ways in which society can improve. Excuse me. It would also be beneficial to have more male teachers in elementary school and middle school in particular, but the reality is they're just not there. Dr. Abigail James, who wrote the excellent book Teaching the Male Brain, which contains a lot of good technical information for teachers, she explains the need for male teachers very excellently. She says, in trying to figure out what it means to be a man, the boy may attempt to be as unlike the adult females surrounding him as possible. He may decide that the proper behavior for men is loud, rude, crude, messy, unacademic, unemotional, uninvolved. The idea that there may be different kinds of masculinities is never considered because there are no male role models for other types of behavior. This is why all the experts state most emphatically that more male teachers are needed to teach our elementary classrooms. There are other ways to introduce positive male role models into the lives of boys. There's also mentoring programs, like where male teachers will mentor male students, where male college students will mentor male high school students, and sometimes where male high school students will then mentor middle school students. Whenever you put a boy, this is one thing I don't have here in my notes, but whenever you put a boy in a leadership role, they tend to raise their expectations of themselves. So not only does that mentoring help the child, the boy that the older male student is mentoring, it tends to help the older male student as well. There's lots of there are some programs in lower ed that invite dads from the community to come in and like read stories, touch base with boys in elementary school. One of the great ones is called Dads of Great Students. I really like that program. I think there's actually a few in Atlanta. Some of these are organized by administrators, but very few. They tend to mostly come from people in the community, parents, community advocates, things like that. And I want to get to the second, jump to the second thing that I highly recommend that needs to change, and that is a systemic restructuring of teacher and administrator training, especially in elementary and middle school education. Even though there's a lot of data that confirms the need to improve educational outcomes for men and boys, most teachers and administrators really just aren't aware of the issue. I went through 2 rounds of teacher training, okay? First as a college instructor, and second through the Region 10 teacher certification program in Texas. And at no point in any of that was I ever told that there was an issue about boys in education. I got a degree in English, and it wasn't until I was halfway through my master's that I even learned that there was a literacy gap, that there was a problem, with boys falling behind in reading and writing. And that's not because someone told me. It's not because some professor, some expert told me. I dug around and found that for myself. But don't take my word. You don't have to take my word for it when it comes to that. If one day you happen to be driving by a university bookstore, feel free to walk in and pick up a book. Hello? Okay. Feel free to walk in and pick up a book on teaching literacy, on diversity and gender in education. I know because I've done this because I'm a nerd. And just look and see if you will find anything that relates to boys' educational issues. 9 times out of 10, you're going to find nothing on it. It's like radio silence. Because of this, many teachers in lower education simply don't understand boys. Here's a telltale sign. Boys are diagnosed with ADHD at twice the rate of girls. You may think that's a lot, and it is, but what's not often talked about is the referral rate, that they are referred by a teacher for diagnosis at 9 times the rate of girls. So not only is there a very reasonable concern that there is a lot of misdiagnoses, but that's really just the tip of the iceberg compared to the number of unnecessary referrals that teachers and many people are just trying to push through the system. So one of the things that is just so odd about the ADHD is the definitions are so vague. They could apply to a lot of students. So what's the difference between, say, a student with ADHD and a truly gifted student? So here's some of the distinctions. A gifted student may daydream because he or she perceives that the material is irrelevant, whereas a student with ADHD has problems sustaining attention. A gifted student tends to have frequently higher activity than the average child, whereas a student with ADHD has frequently higher activity than the average child. A student who is gifted tends to be more concerned with big concepts, tends to ignore ideas, whereas a student with ADHD often has a lack of attention to detail. So these are just a few of the many examples, and I hope you see the big differences, which there aren't any big differences. Behavior that is displayed between gifted students, between ADHD students, very often it is very similar, if not the same. It's not so much, it's a perception issue. How do teachers perceive boy behavior? Teachers are too quick to label boy behavior as deviant. And as you may have learned in sociology or criminology, just because behavior is deviant doesn't mean that it is bad per se. Excuse me, moving on. There's a dogma that has been pervasive in certain sectors of academia and elsewhere over the past several decades that boys and girls are exactly the same. This flies in the face of science. It's not just that male and female brains are structured differently. They have different proportions of behavior-influencing chemicals flowing throughout their bodies. In the book, Boys and Girls Learn Differently, Dr. Michael Gurian, who's very much the champion of what is called differentiated instruction, charts down over 100 structural and functional differences in male and female brains that affect learning and behavior. Believe it or not, boys don't actually hear as well as girls do. So when a boy asks the teacher to repeat herself, maybe he's not necessarily being a smartass. Boys tend to have incredible social pressures placed upon them to not seek help. Boys do not tend to form social bonds the same way that girls do, through simple verbal interactions. I need a drink of water. I should have had this up front. Ooh. Oh, that feels better. Boys do not tend to form social bonds by simple verbal interactions like girls do. They tend to relate to others through external things like games, competitions, projects, things which Dr. Michael Gurian calls mediating objects. Boys tend to be more physically active in their play. When they read and write, they tend to prefer adventure stories that involves some element of physical conflict, which teachers, unfortunately, far too often will characterize as pathologically violent. They tend to like humor that is subversive. This is sometimes characterized by teachers as inappropriate, even though the humor does not venture into the areas of obscene humor. And a lot of teachers tend to crack down on boy behavior, not necessarily because it's bad, not because it's harmful, but just because it kind of bugs the teacher. When boys read history assignments, they'll tend to focus on raw data, raw facts. When girls read history assignments, they may have a tendency to focus on the social implications of what they just read. So for example, if a teacher assigns a certain history passage in homework, and then the next day the students come in and the teacher says, okay, to the male student, what did you read? What did you think about the social implications of this or that or whatnot? The boy may not have an answer, and the teacher may conclude erroneously that he just hasn't read the assignment. But that's not the case. It's not that he didn't read the assignment. It's just that he got something else out of the assignment than the girl sitting right next to him. Boys tend to learn better when learning involves physical activity, competition, and the use of what is called manipulatives. When I say manipulatives, I don't mean things like sadistically manipulating someone to do your will. In a teaching context, manipulatives are physical objects that are used as teaching tools to engage students in hands-on learning. Boys tend to do much better learning language with a heavy dose of phonics instruction, which has an approach of teaching students to build words through phonemes, which are the building blocks of language. They do not do well with other types of language instruction, like what's called whole language instruction, which was very much a fad that came up in the 80s and still persists quite a bit today. Boys are 5 times as likely to be diagnosed with autism. So sometimes maybe it's not the case that someone who is non-social is just some kind of punk. Maybe non-social behavior, which boys tend to display disproportionately, isn't the same as antisocial behavior. But to teachers who like to do everything as a group, who prize what is called connected learning, they aren't always going to see that. This is just a sample of the many things that first-year teachers should be prepared for. But again, if you look at a lot of the books that teachers are being trained by, you won't see any of this mentioned in any of these books whatsoever. All that being said about gender differences in learning, Teachers cannot lose sight of the fact, I'd like to add this disclaimer, teachers cannot lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, every student is an individual learner. Although boys and girls tend to behave and learn differently, that doesn't mean that every single boy and girl will behave and act a certain way. Acknowledging how boys and girls learn different shouldn't be about putting boys in a boy box and girls in a girl box. It should be about broadening the skill sets of teachers so that they can respond to a wider range of learning styles and behaviors. So that's number two. Here's the third thing we need, outreach programs and initiatives. If you go to the Department of Education website, there's a sample of outreach programs that they have for women and girls. You can just go to the Department of Education gender equity section, and it'll show you all of the grants that they give, but they're all for women. They're for teacher training, they're for evaluating models to advance gender equity, to build networks, transition programs, school to work transition programs, guidance and counseling activities, but it's all for women and girls. There's absolutely nothing coming from the federal government for men and boys when it comes to their education issues. Oh, excuse me, losing my notes here. Number four, we need to give men and boys more freedom in defining themselves outside of gender norms and traditional gender roles. And this is more of a cultural thing than necessarily something that comes from academia. In 2011, I had the honor of volunteering at a symposium at UT Austin for Project Males, which stands for Mentoring to Achieve Latino Educational Success. It's a research and mentoring program for Latino students, and they partner with a bunch of community colleges in South Texas. At that event, I spoke with a woman named Janie Mendoza. Janie works for an organization called Capital Idea. That organization delivers financial aid to at-risk students, particularly Black and Latino male students. What she told me is that when male students enroll in these services, for a significant number of them, someone will offer them a job for, say, $12 an hour, and then they're gone. They stop taking classes, they stop taking the aid, things like that. And then after that job dries up, 6 to 7 months later, they're back and they're applying for aid once again. The reason being that they always feel like they have to work full time. They don't feel like they can take any time off from work to give to their studies, to education, even if it's a part-time job. The reality is that society defines men's worth by how much money they earn. Society expects men to provide financially for others, not to be provided for. And it's hard to do that when you're a student. As a disclaimer, I'd like to add, though, that if there are students who don't know what they want to study and they're just enrolling in college just to enroll and racking up debt, I would advise those students to wait. But when there are social pressures that limit the ability of male students to enroll, to take full benefit of the educational services, this is something which very much merits discussion. I seem to have lost my pointer. Here we go. Okay, also sometimes there are resources available for male students who are at risk, although it's not necessarily for male students per se, but just for at-risk students in general. But some of these guys just don't know about them because they've never looked for them. And the reason why they've never looked for them is because they've never looked themselves in the mirror and said, hey, I need help. Acknowledging that men need help is a big problem because there's a lot of pressure against men acknowledging that they need help. For a man to express vulnerability, to acknowledge vulnerability, is considered very, very unmanly. Remember when I mentioned earlier that men are 80% of suicides, and there's a reason for that. There's people who are at risk of suicide who are vocalizing their pain, and sometimes loudly. It's good that they're vocalizing their pain because although they are hurting, since they are talking about it, they will very likely get the help they need. But the people who tend to be the most at risk are the people who never talk about it. There are some people who commit suicide, and I'm sure a lot of people might be able to remember someone who commits suicide, and it's just like out of the blue, like they never knew it would happen. Those are the people who are the most at risk, the people who never talk about it. Men do not engage in help-seeking strategies as much as women do, and that affects many areas of their lives, not just psychologically, but also academically. Some people wonder why people like me, who talk about education issues, will also talk about things like suicide, and here's why. you can give male students as much outreach programs, as many teaching strategies, as many grants, as many scholarships, et cetera, as you want. But none of that is going to matter if the male students who receive those programs can't set foot on campus because they're dead. Similarly, none of that outreach is going to matter if the male students who receive the benefit of those programs can't set foot on campus because they are railroaded out because of sometimes draconian discipline policies. And with that being said, I'm going to move to the next section, which is rights and protections. Has anyone noticed nowadays that schools tend to look a lot more like prisons? Schoolyards used to be open fields where students played freely. Now at many schools, there's no recess. Instead of open fields, they have a perimeter of fences. Entrances and exits to buildings are now very tightly controlled. These entrances usually require walking past one and sometimes two metal detectors. Schools nowadays are built with very few windows, and I've seen at some of them, because I've applied for teaching jobs at some of them, if you walk up to the front door, you will see a security camera staring right at you right in the face. Whenever there's a scuffle or a fight, schools are much likely to employ traditional methods of resolution like counseling, like intervention, like calling the parents. Nowadays, schools are much more likely to just call the cops. Which doesn't take too long in a lot of schools, because nowadays a lot of schools have cops on site, which they call SROs, or school resource officers. Just to give you an idea of how crazy it's getting, a school district in San Antonio, Texas, they installed chips on student IDs, which students are required to wear at all times or else they get written up, to track the movement of over 100,000 students in the district. And whenever they were confronted about this, whenever there were constitutional issues brought up, they actually doubled down and threatened students and parents with fines, with transfers, with suspensions if they failed to comply with these things. Many schools nowadays are labeling children, and almost always boys, as sexual harassers and doling out harsher punishments under that label than they would for what would otherwise be called inappropriate or simply disruptive behavior. It's one thing to give a 16 or an 18-year-old that label, but it's very problematic for a boy who is 6 or 8 years old to be labeled a sexual harasser, for the very simple reason that both boys and girls, prepubescent boys and girls, have no concept of what sexuality is. Every now and then these things make it into the headlines. There was a case of Ryan Blackman in North Carolina. He's not pictured there, but he hugged a teacher out of gratitude for her breaking up a fight between him and another student. That hug earned him the accusation of sexual harassment. He was grabbed by the arm by that teacher and whisked away immediately to the office. In Colorado, a 6-year-old boy named Devontae Meadows, pictured there on the left, he was suspended for sexual harassment for singing the chorus of "I'm Sexy and I Know It." The boy on the right, in North Carolina, a 9-year-old boy named Emmanuel Laquette, he was suspended for sexual harassment for commenting to another student, not to the teacher, but to another student, that the teacher was cute. These are sensational cases, obviously, but they're not just that. They're a sign of the times. We live in a very punitive culture. Our education system lives under the politics of zero tolerance, and the criminal justice system lives under the politics of mass incarceration. That's why we have about 7 million people who are caught up in our criminal justice system. Several million that are actually imprisoned, and then several million more who have limited freedom because they're under parole or probation. That's not a very good combination for schools to be highly punitive and for our criminal justice system to be expanding incredibly like it is. There's a phrase that describes this phenomenon of schools channeling students more to prison at times than to success. It's called the school-to-prison pipeline. It's traditionally been applied when it comes to racial politics. If you go to the ACLU webpage, it'll talk about the school-to-prison pipeline. And there's a very, very fitting reason why it has been applied to racial politics. But there is a certain degree of intersectionality in that it shares. There's a lot of similar traits between how we punish boys and how the school-to-prison pipeline, the discussion around that has traditionally been explored by civil rights advocates. Also, I think we need to take greater care and realize what we're doing whenever we suspend or expel a student, especially in lower education. What we're doing whenever we're kicking out a student for several days or more, what we're essentially doing is telling that student, you don't belong here. This is not your community. It doesn't just create a physical distance. It creates a very real psychological distance. And at some point, that student is going to have to reintegrate into the community. And unfortunately, at this point, it seems like a lot of the schools care more about punishing the student than it is in making sure they are well integrated into the community. Freedom of speech, this is a very delightful topic, is another important human right that is very much at risk in modern academia, particularly higher education. Here are some examples. There was a series of talks on men's and boys' education issues at various universities in Canada over the last 2 years. At a presentation by Dr. Warren Farrell on the boy crisis, in order to prevent people from hearing him speak, a gang, and that's what it could best be used to describe them, a gang of feminists decided to form a human barricade in front of the entrance so that no one could get in. The talk was delayed for an hour, and police had to come in and break up the barricade. At another presentation by Janice Fiamengo on misandry in education, a bunch of feminists decided that they didn't like what she had to say, so instead of showing up and listening to what she had to say and asking incisive questions, they just decided to pull the fire alarm. And they did it again in another presentation next month. Everyone had to exit the building, and then once fire trucks came out, they and verified that there was no fire, they could then proceed. But unfortunately, it cut deeply into the presentations. This is very excuse me. This is me losing my mouse. This is very characteristic of feminists and many of their ideological allies who oppose the human rights of men and boys. It's very common for them to do things like rip posters down, shout people down, try and rig debates so that there's not a level playing field, silence people, usually by making false accusations of harassment or threats, while themselves usually doing everything that they wrongly accuse others of, and sometimes worse. It's like they just totally bypass making any kind of rational discussion and just try and find the shortest path that they can to try and silence people. The common rationalization that is given by feminists and for these kinds of suppression tactics is that everyone they target with these suppression tactics is a bitter, misogynistic woman hater who wants to send all women back to the sandwich mines, there to labor for all of eternity. And for a lot of their true believer friends who haven't done their homework, that tends to work. But what doesn't tend to work so well for them is that a significant portion of people will actually come to us, come to A Voice for Men, come to A Voice for Male Students. They'll hear what we have to say. And then after reviewing that, they'll come to a very different conclusion, that the real haters are not those advocating the human rights of men and boys. They're actually the feminists. And you can see one of them, this masked feminist on the right, sorry we hurt your man feels. That is quite obviously a very extreme feminist by her presentation. But as we'll see, she's really not too far off from what we see in a lot of academia today. While we're on the subject of hate, this is a good time to transition to our last section, institutional and cultural bias, always a fun section. In 2006, Newsweek magazine came out with an issue called The Boy Crisis. It was an explosive article because it was the first time when a national publication had really talked about boys' education issues and framed it with that kind of rhetoric. It featured an article by Peg Tyre, who also wrote a book called The Trouble with Boys, which is a great read. I recommend it. One of the people who responded to her article was a woman named Dr. Sandra Anderson. She's a former law professor, and she's also the current chair of the Board of Trustees at Ohio University. And she deserves to be quoted at length. This is what she had to say. Boys in a crisis? In my grandmother's day, only men could vote. When I was a girl, only boys could play sports. In the Roman Catholic Church, only men can be priests. In certain societies today and throughout history, girls can't attend school and women can't work or show their faces in public. In China, girl babies are discarded because boys are favored. In America, glass ceilings block females from access or power, money, and leadership. On playgrounds, a common taunt among boys falls along these lines: you cry/act/talk/throw like a girl. So for the fraction of a nanosecond in human history that boys are perceived to be on the short end of the stick compared with girls, you call this a crisis? Come on, guys, you take a turn at second-class status for once. And again, that's Dr. Sandra Anderson, Ohio University Chair of the Board of Trustees. Now, there's several different schools of thought there. For one, obviously she's citing a lot of women's issues very much in a vacuum, in a one-sided fashion. There is a significant debate to be had. Are women who didn't have the ability to vote in 1915, was life really that much harder for them than men who were drafted into World War I in 1915, who had their guts ripped out, who were ordered to rip the guts of other people out, who saw their friends' guts ripped out in front of them, and who often came home and committed suicide or had extreme psychological problems? Are those experiences, are men's experiences, are they really all living on cloud nine compared to what women had back then? We could all, men and women, we could all play this game. Anyone can cherry pick all these things presented in a vacuum, and then use that to kind of beat someone over the head and say, focus all on me. But that's not the way that real equality works. It's about, everyone, equality for everyone. Something I want to, thank you. This is Dr. Anderson is a very classic example of how people who very likely in her case I think started off being probably good people, but eventually becoming a force for evil in the world. And unfortunately, in my experience and observation, there are a lot of people in academia very much like Dr. Anderson. I don't want to say that they're everywhere in every university. But they do tend to be concentrated in two particular areas. First and foremost, the humanities. Women's studies, gender studies, sociology, anthropology, in many cases English departments as well. And the second place where they tend to be concentrated in is certain administrative departments. Like departments of diversity, departments of student affairs, although I hear that the Department of Student Affairs here at KSU is pretty good. Also, in my experience, the higher up you go in academia, the worse it tends to be. So the problems with misandry, with hatred of men and boys that we see in places like Duke, which we'll get to in a second, you may not see it so much at a community college, but go to the University of Maryland, go to Harvard University, go to Duke University, and you'll see a lot of that culture start to come out. A bigger problem with the bias being worse as you go up is that those are actually the schools with money. A lot of community colleges, a lot of the students that go to them are economically disadvantaged. They don't have the money to spend on a lot of outreach programs. The schools that have tends to have the worst bias against men and boys, unfortunately, are often the ones that are the best economically situated to do something about it because they have all the connections and all the money. So that's a very unfortunate situation. If you need a good example of how it gets worse the higher up you go, look no further than the story of Duke University, which is what I'm going to close here with. It's a story which everyone, I think, should know about if they're interested in education politics. When I was a student, I was a student in 2006 at A&M at the time. I was teaching 2 years later, and information started to trickle in about what had happened. And we're like, yeah. Someone got falsely accused of rape or whatnot at Duke University, and a bunch of people went crazy. But it wasn't until like 2009 and 2010 when the full impact of what really happened at Duke University really came home and hit hard for a lot of people, because at that point a lot of the case materials had been released. There were books written, and it's a very important case. So I'm going to go over it in brief here. In 2006, a young woman who was hired as a stripper falsely accused 3 lacrosse members, all of them students at Duke, of gang raping her at a frat house. The evidence in support of the 3 young men was overwhelming. The accuser changed her story, as well as the number of men she accused, not once, not twice, but many times. A security camera at an ATM, which you'll see right here, filmed one of the 3 male students who was supposed to be raping her at the time, filmed him on the other side of the town. There was DNA evidence found on the accuser that matched absolutely none of the men that she accused. There was also a stripper that was hired to dance alongside her that was there for like 95% of the time that she was with Crystal Mangum. She said that at no point could it have ever been possible for the accuser, Crystal Gail Mangum, to be raped. She also claimed that in the taxi ride away from the frat house, that the accuser asked her to put marks on her to make it look like she had been assaulted. And finally, the accuser herself, Crystal Gail Mangum, confessed that she had made the whole thing up. There was so much evidence in support of the 3 young men who were wrongly accused that the district attorney went beyond simply dropping the charges and declared that he believed them all to be innocent. But none of those facts really mattered. 88 members of the Duke faculty, in a very disastrous decision, speaking for 5 academic departments and 10 academic programs, signed their names to a statement in which they openly took the side of the accuser, and that statement was published. They sought it to be published in the school newspaper, the Duke Chronicle, and surprise, surprise, not only were almost all of them from the humanities, 72% of the faculty from the Women's Studies Department, which, as I hope most of us know, is basically feminist studies, signed the statement. Many professors in the group of 88 went beyond just doing that. As they were teaching their classes, as normal routine of teaching their classes, they abandoned their syllabi and just launched into to a conversation about the case, using their classrooms as essentially bully pulpits to try and sway the students to presume the guilt of the men who are accused. One professor named Houston Baker demanded the immediate expulsion of not just the 3 young men who were wrongly accused, but 46 members of the lacrosse team. In his book, I think there was one more. There was another one, I didn't have it in my notes here, but there was the chemistry professor named Steve Baldwin. He was, I'll get to that later, sorry, one second. In his book, Tenured Radicals, How Politics Has Corrupted Higher Education, Dr. Richard Kimball says, for months, nearly the entire faculty fell into one of 2 camps, those who demanded the verdict first and the trial later, and those whose silence enabled their vigilante colleagues to set the tone. There's a question of not just misandry in academia, not just presuming the guilt of men who are accused, but also this incredible conformity, this acquiescence, this go along to get along culture which really is part of the broader academic culture. That's another very problematic element as well. There were only 2 people at Duke that I can think of that said, hey, maybe our community of professors shouldn't rush to judgment against our own students. One of them was Coach Mike Pressler, coach of the lacrosse team. He was immediately fired. Another one was a chemistry professor named Steve Baldwin. Within 24 hours of him dissenting with a rush to judgment by his colleagues, he was invited via email by humanities professor Carrie Haney to settle their differences in his office with a fist fight. But perhaps my favorite quote about this case comes from a feminist professor, not a professor at Duke, feminist professor Wendy Murphy, and this is just perfect. It just so encapsulates the mindset. On an interview at National Public Radio, she says, "I'm really tired of people suggesting that you're somehow un-American if you don't respect the presumption of innocence. Because you know what that sounds like to a victim? Presumption that you're a liar." Wendy Murphy is a professor of all things law, and perhaps even more scary, she also occasionally acts as a sex crimes prosecutor. I don't think I want her anywhere near the legal system, except perhaps on the wrong side of the legal system if she gets into too much trouble. But back at Duke, students acting in behalf of social justice paraded around campus a banner reading "castrate." And I just want to stop there and ask you guys to think about what this means, because it just tells so much about the mindset of these people. Isn't castrating a guy, which is obviously against their will, isn't that gender-based violence? These students are carrying around a banner promoting gender-based violence, essentially as a means to, in their minds, demonstrate how much they oppose gender-based violence. This is the way these people think. It's just totally Orwellian. They also placed around campus what essentially amounted to wanted posters of the entire lacrosse team. Excuse me, at one point, one of the lacrosse players was walking across campus. He was surrounded by an entire group of protesters, and they all shouted repeatedly, "Confess, confess." And I find this all very interesting, because if you look at Title IX guidelines, not what's written into federal law under Title IX, but the guidelines that come out from the Department of Education on how to interpret and enforce Title IX, There are very strict guidelines saying that school staff, students should not retaliate against those who accuse other students of rape, because that would be you're not supposed to retaliate against someone who might be a victim of rape. That's bad. But there is no such provision. There are no such provisions under Title IX, nor does there seem to be any kind of ethical consciousness among far too many people in forbidding retaliation against men who are accused of, and far too often wrongly accused of rape. Duke University, there's some very interesting implications here. Duke University is not some kind of backwater community college that is isolated from the conversation on what makes good academic or administrative practice. It's considered among our top tier educational institutions, considered among our most influential academic institutions. As I've said in the past, and as some of these other speakers will demonstrate time and time again, misandry in academia is not just, these are not just isolated incidences. It's not just a collection of infrequent and disassociated anomalies. This is stuff that arises in the midst of influential and supportive peer groups. In a way that, again, cannot just be characterized as something that just randomly happens. The students who carried around a banner reading "castrate" and the 88 professors who signed that statement, they were acting in a very symbolic manner and in a way that designates and promotes shared beliefs. And as you will see and continue to see, Duke is far from the only university, the only school that rushes to judgment against its own students when it comes to accusations of sexual assault. The feminist position, a lot of people are taught this in sociology and in women's studies, gender studies, etc. They're just overtly taught that men cannot possibly be the targets of sexism or hatred because in the feminist worldview, sexism against men, misandry, has no institutional presence. If that ever could have been a valid argument, I think it reasonable to say that it is not now. There's no way it could be now. The 2006 Duke Lacrosse false rape case was an incredible learning opportunity. It was an opportunity for the academic community to step back, engage in a little bit of introspection and say, hey, what just happened? And more importantly, to ask, what kind of culture must exist on our college campuses that would create something like this? And that's not the only learning opportunity that we have had. The educational decline of men and boys has been an ongoing learning opportunity for decades. Why has it been ignored by so many for so long? Is it because too many people in academia, especially those who claim to champion equality and diversity, is it because they do not know, despite the fact that many of them are paid to know? Or is it because too many of them have found not a reason, but more like a rationalization not to care? The cause of educational equity for men and boys cannot just be an academic movement, although it needs to be at least that, because the barriers to widespread institutional change are not necessarily a matter of the letter of education policy. It's not just a matter of changing teaching practices. There needs to be a simultaneous transformation of the moral fabric of the academic culture. There needs to be, we need to have an academic culture which says, that educational equity for men and boys is a good thing, and educational equity for women and girls is a good thing. A culture which believes that values like equality and diversity, are only values when we apply them to all groups consistently. It requires a reaffirmation of our value system, which unfortunately we have lost along the way. And that is what a truly progressive movement towards educational equity would look like. And that's why groups like KSU Men are so important. That's all I have to say.